Hi, I'm Kristen and this is Scrap Fabric Love, and I have recently finished a very special quilt for a very special lady who entered my life in my sewing room rather unexpectedly all the way from Australia. Her name is Christine, and the story started when she, out of the blue, sent me a package of her low volume fabrics. So low volume, if you don't know what that means, is just sort of like a fabric that reads white or doesn't have a strong pattern or a strong color on it. These kind of colors.
This is the parcel. I actually did show it in a previous video. That first fabric with the strongest colors on it, I actually used part of that in another quilt, which I'll show you in probably a month or two on the channel. But as you can see, her fabrics had some tiny bits and some bigger bits. So this was the pile of fabric that I started off with.
Anyway, I wasn't expecting it. I didn't know her, and she told me that she had recently been diagnosed with cancer and that it wasn't something she was going to get better from. So she had been planning to make a quilt similar to one I'd made on my channel earlier, a low volume crumb quilt, but she didn't think she'd get a chance to use the fabrics. And like me, I guess, she didn't want them to go to waste. That's certainly an ethos of mine that I think Christine shares. So I know she gave some fabric away to some other more local quilting friends, but somehow in clearing out her sewing room, she thought of me, even though we've never met. So when I received the package, I was obviously touched. And it really spoke to me because I have, as I've spoken about at the channel before, had quite a fair amount of loss in my family. Both my parents are gone, and my father died 10 years ago of cancer. So it was all felt very close to my heart, and I wanted to do something for Christine. And Christine was not asking me to do anything specific with the fabric. She just didn't want it to go to waste, and I think she knew that I wouldn't throw it out, that I would either find something to sew it with or I would give it to someone who would, and she was right. But after hearing her story, I just felt like I wanted to do something for her. I am one of these people who's very attached to the physical objects of the people I've lost, and so I thought it made sense if the fabrics she'd sent me could go back to someone in her family as a quilt. So I offered to make a quilt out of her fabrics for a member of her family, and she chose her granddaughter, who's about to turn 20, and it'll be her birthday at the end of July. So that's what we did. And I got to know Christine over email as we planned out the quilt and what we were going to do. And she sent me some lovely photos. I'm not sharing them because not everybody wants to be on YouTube, but suffice it to say, I felt like I got to know her a little bit, even though obviously we are a whole world away in terms of geography. And I really did enjoy the creative process of using this very specific bag of fabric to make a special quilt. I actually used pretty much every last scrap of Christine's fabric. I'll show you a picture of what I have left. It's very minimal. And the rest went into either the front or the back, and I supplemented with only a tiny bit of my own fabric for the binding and the backing. But anyways, enough of the intro. Let me get on with showing you the process of making this special quilt.
So here's Christine's fabric. So obviously I went through this previously. I've already cut up the bits I want of this for the other quilt I was going to use it for. So I'm keeping these. They'll probably end up in the quilt. And then I've got a big variation of small pieces and bigger pieces. So I'm going to approach it kind of like a crumb improv thing. So Christine had been collecting these fabrics after watching my low volume crumb quilt video quite a while ago. That was a quilt I made over a couple of years, just making sections at a time using low volume crumbs. But you can see from her fabric how it would lend itself to this kind of quilt. My original low volume crumb quilt was done with no measuring, not even a set crumb block size, just totally improv. So that's the same way I'm going to approach it for Christine's quilt. I will use sort of longer bits and start piecing the smaller bits to it, and then trim from there. So some of the longer bits will get shorter when they get added to these little bits, basically, rather than making, one big block of all these little bits. It's just the same fabric. So there'll be more variation between the fabrics, basically, is the idea. So the only fabric in here that I'm not sure about for the front is this one, because it's more like a children's fabric. So it's koalas. Christine's from Australia, so her granddaughter will be too, but her granddaughter is turning 20. So I'm still going to include this, but I think I'm going to put this in the backing fabric so she can see it and have lovely childhood memories of her grandmother there. But if she wants to display the front of the quilt somewhere as an adult, wherever she lives, it won't have the kind of children's theme on the front. That's what I'm thinking. So this is, how big is this now? So there's like a long piece. I feel like this was cut from something else, maybe a sheet or something. So right up my street, that kind of upcycling. So there's 2 long strips. So they'll be in the backing somewhere. I'll probably use some of my own fabric for the backing, but if there's leftover of this, I'll try and include it in the backing as well. So I'm going to set these 2 aside for now. Okay, so next what I'm doing is I'm separating out anything that looks like a thin long strip. So I've got this, and I'm just going to put that in one pile. Anytime I see something like that, it's already a strip of any length, like that's fine, right? And then I'm going to have another pile for these smaller bits, like that's, well, probably this too, right? These little bits that are definitely smaller than a strip that we're going to call crumbs, right? Of whatever size, even that, because I would like to cut that up and have bits of it for texture in different places in the quilt. So that's 2 pieces, right? So I'm going to put that in there, even though it's a little bit longer. That'll go there. All of these, I think. Oh, some of these are strips. Hang on. Are they? No, we'll call those crumbs. Okay. And that's just going to give me some place to start piecing what's going to be the center of some slabs, I think is how I'm going to do this, right? So there's a strip. And I'm going to go through and find more. So that's like a strip. It's a different width. It doesn't matter because I'm just going to be piecing and trimming as I go. But this gives me somewhere to start with the smaller pieces, and then I'll use the bigger pieces to build up around as I see what I'm working with here. So there's some more strips. And then I think I'm going to make another pile of, because these are like slightly larger. These might be good for making things fit with other things. So when I have like say 2 sections and I want to make one a little bit longer to fit with another, strips will help with that too. But I'm going to have, so I'm basically just going to organize this in various shapes so I know what I'm working with.
If you're doing this with your own fabrics, you don't necessarily need to pre-sort. Just start with some crumbs and some strips, and then you can just pull from your stash and add as you go along.
So here's what I got. These are really big pieces, at least a fat quarter, some of them way bigger. So I'm going to save those for now because I can use them to kind of make a background for the smaller bits that I'm going to put together in a different way. So these are large-ish sections, but they're definitely not fat quarters. So they might get cut up or they might be used for like coping strips. These can be used for coping strips, and these can be used just to start off blocks I'm going to call them blocks, but like sections as crumbs. And then these are some other, those go in here. These are kind of the larger scraps, coping strip things. I'm thinking, looking at these, I quite like how this one is in between the white and the creams. So I might cut this one into strips so it can kind of be more places in the quilt. That's what I'm thinking. Let me move this bubble out. And then I would just make a start piecing, because the thing with this kind of quilt where there's no pattern and you're not sure how it's going to turn out is you just have to start. You just have to join one thing to another, and then it develops a life of its own and you can see what it's going to look like. So this isn't something I'm sketching out ahead of time. Her fabrics are going to dictate what this ends up looking like.
So I started with the pile of crumbs and the pile of strips. So I sometimes would sew 2 crumbs together, but often I was doing this, where I would lay down a long strip and then take the crumbs and just sew them on all the way along the strip. So I would trim and cut that later. And that way I can break up the fabric from the strips, because it's going to get trimmed, is going to look like a crumb in the quilt. But the other version of this that I did, that Christine saw in the video, was entirely crumbs. And then as it got bigger, I added strips just to make things fit. But in this case, obviously I'm working with this set bundle of fabrics, only some of which are crumbs.
So I need to make the larger bits become crumb-like by cutting them up, basically. So I could have cut them up ahead of time and done that, but this is the method that makes sense to my brain. So I add the strip, I add the crumbs, and I just keep piecing. And when I run out of that strip, grab another one. And then it's just chain piece, chain piece, chain piece all the way along. If you're new to quilting, chain piecing is just when you don't break your thread in between piecing the next step. I did, as you've seen there, sometimes if I thought the strip was going on too long and I wanted just more variety in the fabrics, cut a really long strip and use it later. And sometimes I would also take the long end, or the short end, of a strip and join it to a bit of another strip. So all I'm doing is trying to get pieces of fabric together, and I'm going to start building this thing up. So this is not a super quick process, but it's really fun if you like this sort of thing. Some people don't, but I really, really enjoy this. So I'm not really it's just sort of making choices based on what two fabrics I want together in the moment. You can think about it, not think about it. People will approach that part differently. And you just put on a podcast or talk to someone on the phone, and there's absolutely no thinking because you don't have to measure anything. And you can just sew and sew and sew until your piles are gone. So once I'd pieced all of the crumbs and those initial strips together, I'm just cutting them apart. I'm just rough cutting them at this point, because then I'm going to take the whole pile to my living room, set up my ironing board, watch something on TV, press them all, and then trim them all. So this is very kind of circular process of sew, iron, trim, sew, iron, trim, and you just build up all the way along. And again, you don't have to think all that much. All I'm trying to do when I'm trimming is get a straight edge, and then I end up with a box of units, and then I start piecing them to either other units or strips. So that's what I'm doing here. So this is me trying to find units that are roughly the same length as each other. If there's a little bit to trim off on the edge, that's fine. If there's way bigger, then you do the same thing as with the strips, like here, where I'm adding one unit there and another unit, and I go along like that. So I'm just building and building and building. And you would be surprised how often you find these little crumb units do match each other and they are the right size. It isn't frustrating like it sounds like it'll be if you're used to measuring everything to make sure it's going to fit with each other. And I did still have strips and big pieces. So this is where I was using that pile of slightly bigger pieces that I showed you that wasn't the yardage and it wasn't the strips. So I'm starting to add that to some of these units. And then at this point, I think I was deciding, I was liking how this was starting to look. And I thought what I needed was not great big huge pieces, but more strips to start building these sections larger and larger. So that's what I decided to do next. So I did still set aside some of the larger sort of yardage pieces, but for a lot of it, I trimmed it into random widths of strips. I wasn't measuring or thinking about it. I was just cutting random widths. And then I repeated the exact same process as before, adding the units I've already made to other units, chain piecing this massive long snake of units, and then ironing them, trimming them, and then I had this box overflowing with units. At that point, I decided to lay them out and see where I was in terms of size and how many of them were getting bigger and how many of them were smaller, because there were different sizes depending on the strips that I'd added or the units that I've added to another unit. So there's little bits here, as you can see, and then there's big bits. So I laid these all out and I sent a progress photo to Christine. This is not anything to do with the layout of the quilt. This was just to give me a kind of idea of how far I'd gotten with it and how much I needed to keep doing to finish it off. So those were the units, and then I just took, again, that pile of strips that I'd cut, and I added those units to those strips, and sometimes those units to each other if I found two that were sort of the same length as each other. Because again, when I'm trimming, I'm just trying to trim straight edges on either side so that when I go to join it to something else, it works. And again, you really would be surprised how often those units end up very close in length to each other, and it's not a huge deal to kind of just make them fit with each other. When they don't, I just would add a strip or let it not fit and then know I'm going to cut off and have another little unit to start another section the next time I go round. So again, very circular. I don't know how many rounds of adding stuff I did. It was kind of like sew during the day for a little bit, cut them all apart, and then when I'm watching TV with my husband, I would be doing the ironing and the trimming and putting it in the box, ready to do another round the next day. And I quite liked the repetitiveness of that process and just seeing the units build and build and build. And as I said, this wasn't a quick process, which is why I've used so much sped up video for this. If you are interested in seeing how I'm lining these up and what I'm putting with what, turn the volume down, press the gear icon below the video, which is the settings, and you can slow the video down and watch it at whatever speed you like. So at this point, my sections were getting to a good size. So I was starting to join slabs or units or whatever you want to call them. They're probably bigger than most blocks, but I didn't measure, so I cannot tell you what size these were. And you can kind of see the variety of the fabrics and how, you've got some longer strips and some smaller crumbs. It's probably a little bit more uniform than my previous crumb quilt. There are some angles, but a lot of her fabric would have been squares and strips and rectangles to start off with, not as much oddly shaped bits. So this is where I've got to with these. So they're in, as you can see, kind of big sections. So I just kept adding things together that were roughly the same size. You'd be surprised how often, even though I'm not measuring, they end up being close enough and you're just trimming a bit. Like here, for example. So if I line that up right, so I just have to trim a tiny bit there if I join that. And that's a bit too thick anyway, that strip, so I'm okay with that. And I could probably join these two. I'll move this over a bit. Boop. And that would be okay. And then I just keep going. And if I need to add strips to larger sections to start making it work, that's fine. They're largely, most of them are somewhat straightish rectangles. Some of them are a bit squiff, but the whole thing will be squared at the end once I've quilted it anyway. So that's fine. So anyway, that's what I'm doing. I'm just continuing to make the sections bigger and bigger until I end up with a quilt top. Okay, so this is probably hard to see because it's late at night, so the lighting is not ideal, but I basically have it in 3 bits. So this here is the backing that I've pieced. I'll show you that in a bit. But then I just have it laid out so I can see roughly. Obviously, I need the backing to be bigger than the quilt to put it on the long arm. So I've got this is one long section from here all the way to there. And then there's a big section here. And then what I'm having to do is match the length. So I've cut another section and pieced this bit here. And so now I just need to join this to this, and then that section to that. And then I should have basically a quilt top. And I think it's gonna be somewhere in the regions of 70 or 72 inches square. And once I've quilted it and trimmed it up, it might end up a little bit smaller than that, but it'll be a good throw size basically. So apologies for the slightly shaky and strangely lit camera angle, but I just wanted to show you kind of this stage of it when it's kind of, you've done your jigsaw and it's just that last little bit. So yeah, so I'll just finish that off and then I've got to get it quilted. So this was the quilt top. Once those sections were joined together, I was really happy with it at this stage. And then this was the backing. I sort of put it together kind of log cabin style, just starting with one piece of fabric and going round and round until it was big enough. I did use a little bit of my own fabric near the end, but a lot of that will end up getting trimmed off once it's quilted. So I got it loaded up on the long arm. We had discussed over email what we were going to do for the quilting, and we ended up on wavy lines, which I've used before. There are actually lots of options, obviously, that you can use for a crumb quilt like this. I think the last one I used I think it was a stipple, and I think the next one I would like to do straight lines or even a crosshatch of straight lines. I think that could be cool and maybe make it look a bit more modern. The wavy lines are going to give it a bit of a crinkle. It's going to make it more cozy than kind of strictly modern, if you know what I mean. I've talked on the channel about using alternative battings for quilts, which I do very often. But for this one, I went with a bamboo batting because obviously it's going to be a gift, and I felt like it was a special project. So that is the batting I use if I'm ever doing something that just I want to be that extra bit nicer. And I think that's also the same batting I used in the quilt that's on my wall, that people often ask me what batting was in that because they think it looks cozy and comfy, and it is. So yeah, I can recommend bamboo batting if you haven't tried it. It's also a bit more eco-friendly as well than some of the alternatives. So it was all going fine until I got to the end. This is an issue I often have because I don't properly baste my quilts. I have tried it before and the basting just got in my way. Probably something to do with how I did it. So I float my quilt tops. But what ended up happening was that when I got to the end, it just started rippling like crazy. So this is me reloading the quilt back on the long arm after taking it off and unpicking 5 rows of stitching because I just was not happy with it. These last rows still are probably not my best, but they're better than they were for sure. And it was at this point, I think, when I did start feeling a bit of stress about the quilt because I had wanted the quilting to maybe go slightly different than what it did, which I'm sure is a feeling that lots of people can relate to. And I'm not bringing it up to be like, I'm going to show you the flaws before you see them yourself. What I wanted to talk about with this is kind of that sometimes that stress is not about the quilt. So, for example, this isn't something Christine asked me to do. Yes, it's for her family. Yes, she's very sick. However, they have quilts that she's made previously. They have heirlooms of hers. This is just something we're doing to connect to each other because she reached out and because it touched me. Do you know what I mean? And she's watched the channel, so she knows that my quilts aren't perfect, so she's not stressing about that. So the stress that I was feeling, I think, was something else. It might have been to do with maybe how it was connecting to my own grief for members of my family. I have an issue that comes up for me most Julys because it was July that my dad and my grandma passed away within 6 days of each other. And it's like my body remembers. So I will often get a very strange, it'll be different every year, but like a strange physical symptom. And I will be stressing about it and thinking there's something really wrong with me and totally focusing on it. One year I couldn't keep my dinners down and I was throwing up all the time. And I was thinking there was something wrong with my stomach. But then the month passes and I realized that was my brain distracting me from not wanting to remember and not wanting to think about all of that. So when I started, this wasn't quite July, but, we were coming up to it and it related to cancer. So, I do feel like I was probably fixating on trying to make the quilt quote unquote perfect as a distraction of thinking about what it was reminding me of. And I don't want Christine to feel guilty if she's listening to this, because we do all need to kind of process these things. And, it's part of our lives and we can't get away from it. Nobody can. Death and sickness and all of these things are just part of life. But once I realized that might be what my brain was doing, then I was able to sort of calm down about it a little bit more. Also, I did show the quilt to my quilty folk inside my scrap club, and they were quite kind about it and made me feel better about it as well. So it was kind of after that that I started thinking, what is it that's making me feel this way about it? And that's when the penny kind of dropped. And everything just sort of calmed down. Anyway, this is a very long montage of me trimming the quilt. I spend so long trying to square quilts up. It takes ages, especially with a crumb quilt like this, because there's nothing to sort of register on. Do you know what I mean? If you had a block quilt, you could sort of put the ruler up against the edges of a block and that that's the square edge and everything. So at this point, I was using the floorboards on my floor, which I don't actually know whether they're straight or not, but I mean, they look like straight lines. So I was lining bits up with the floorboards and just trimming and making it smaller and smaller. So although it was going to be a square, it ended up being a rectangle. It's definitely still a good throw size, but I'm not sure I even took a note of what size it ended up being copying, but it was fairly squarish by the time I got to this. And then I moved on to binding. So the binding was a mixture of any strips that were left over from the rest of the quilt, as well as some white from my own stash just to make it long enough. And this is the finished quilt. And that's the back. And I sent these photos to Christine. She seemed happy with it. And then I vacuum packed and sent it off to her. Before I had even found the right envelope to post it in, Christine sent, again out of nowhere, some lovely presents for my boys as a way of saying thank you.
What? Yes. What? Chocolate! The rainbow surfer.
What's yours? Possum Magic. Cool. What do you say, guys? What do you say?
Thank you.
What do you? Gifts were these lovely Australian children's books and some chocolate, both of which they were thrilled with. Happy to report that the quilt arrived safe and sound. Christine's got it on her bed to snuggle under until it's time to hand it over for her granddaughter's birthday. I also promised Christine that I would thank everyone who commented on the last video when I was showing her fabrics initially, sending her lots of well wishes. She really, really appreciated that, and she did read them all. So thank you to all of you who did that. And Christine's had some positive results from some recent scans. So obviously cancer treatment is never going to be fun and it's a long road, but she's doing as well as she can be and sounding pretty positive in her emails. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about that. And if you like scrap quilts and making quilts with not very many rules, then I would love it if you would come back, visit the channel again, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to connect even more, I have a scrap club over on Patreon. It's basically my no rules, no judgment quilty community. We meet on the last Sunday of the month live on Zoom for loads of fun show and tell and sewing chat. And it's just a lovely group of people. We do group quilts, we do mini quilt swaps, and it's just a lovely bunch. So if you are looking for your quilting people and you haven't found them yet, maybe come give us a try. The link's in the video description. Anyway, thanks so much for spending time with me, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.